Okay, I saw a really great short the other day by Pythagoras in Boots. If you don't really follow him, he's well worth taking a look at, about the overall system of Liverpool's midfield and how maybe at the moment some of the give and take, the push and pull, but the isolated system of the midfield is not really doing the gentle balancing that Arne wants Liverpool's team to do. And maybe the seesaw isn't quite working at the moment. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I think it is, first of all, really interesting for this season. But secondly, it's also a clue for me as to where the team is going and what we're expecting out this side when you put all of the pieces together. This might spread out over a number of videos, but let's unpack the headlines of relationism versus positional play and the difference between those two, and why Arne Slot has got this finely balanced, intelligent midfield, which maybe just needs a little bit of time, but also a little bit of tweaking in defence, a little bit of tweaking in attack, and a little bit of width from these new fullbacks that we have. First of all, let's start with the midfield, right? Last season, we had a really great balanced midfield, one that was rotating, but also was incredibly industrious and hardworking. It wasn't returned back to the Fabinho, Henderson, Gini, Wijnaldum days, but it certainly was a midfield that when you looked at it, you thought, wow, like what is it that dynamic trio can't do? There is defence, there is transition away from the defence, there is great attacking, there's complementary play to the front line. And it felt as if, well, maybe this could be Liverpool's, midfield and the shape of our midfield for years or even a couple of seasons to come. But it seems as if already we're moving away from that shape of midfield, and we're looking now at who, first of all, obviously a lot of this is based on the fact that we're looking at positions rather than personnel. But we will look at personnel once we looked at positions. First of all, some people are going to just be instantly saying, well, we didn't have Ryan Gravenberch, so we didn't have that balance that maybe we initially wanted. And maybe when we get him back in the side, there will be a bit more balance. And I've got to admit, I agree with that. I love the industrious nature of what McAllister did when he came on. I love what Szoboszlai does. I think sometimes he takes risks and that can be perceived as someone playing badly, but that's kind of your prerogative. And then obviously I'm interested to see when Curtis Jones plays, or I'm interested to see where Florian Wirtz kind of floats. And, just overall how we kind of balance out that midfield. Now, this is where he was talking about relationism and positional play, or positionism versus relational play. Position is obviously one where we're thinking about what the position of that player is and playing within what most people would call a more rigid structure or something with a little bit more structure. Pep Guardiola is very famous for this. Obviously, he loves players to hang out on the wing. He talks about the T that he draws on the field. To an extent, Klopp was this kind of guy, but there are certain rules around that. Obviously, there are plenty of different managers who've applied this down the years, and it's worked for them because people, Mourinho, incredibly positional, yeah. Then we're talking about relationism. Now, relationism is much more about judging where the opposition are at any one time, and then in many ways, like working out where you need to be. So if your other midfielders there, then you can swap roles with them. And Liverpool's midfielder were very good last year at swapping roles when someone else pushed on, someone else kind of, as I said, empathetically, and I said that so much last season, would read where the other one would go and go back into that position, maybe even taking on some of those responsibilities and knowing some of those responsibilities. That can't continue with the way that we want to play these fullbacks, with the way that we want to play this new forward line, with the way that Wirtz wants to play, with the places that Wirtz needs to be in order to maximise his output, and also, by the way, to maximise the central defensive midfielders. We need to tweak that a little bit, because you can't just say, well, you rotate and you rotate and you rotate. Equally also, because we've seen already that is it's quite a weak system, because oppositions very easily exploit that when we're not aware of it. For instance, Wirtz didn't, this is, again, I don't necessarily agree with this, but some people are saying Wirtz didn't get back and cover one of the passes from Wharton for that second goal that Palace got in the Community Shield, and therefore when Liverpool were pulling up, Palace were pushing the other way and it turned the play around. First of all, it's one of Wharton's great strengths, is putting the ball back onto the opposition, which is why I'd be quite interested in seeing him in this midfield in one of those two deeper line positions. But secondly, it's also where you're looking at Liverpool just learning new positions and possibly being in a bit of a holding pattern until we can get in two key signings for us, Isak and, well, I think Mark Gray, and I think we are still in for him in the end of this window, and I'll tell you why almost in a whole other video. At the moment, we're leaving those two centre backs quite exposed, and I think This is a big call. I think Liverpool are going to move towards more of a back three feel in that back line. And we've already seen Gravenberch kind of dropping between the two of them. We saw Endo come on. We saw 3 centre-backs played at one point in the game where we kind of pushed in Joe Gomez. But there was like a little bit of pushing on from them. Endo also pushed on. A couple of people caught out of position. And I think in traditional terms, we think of like a centre-back that can go into midfield as like John Stones or someone like that, right? That still might happen. I think that's still a very reasonable rotation to think of in the Liverpool team if it has Mark Gray or it has, I don't know, is Leone really that kind of guy? I think Mark Gray is that guy, right? I think that our system would hinge quite a lot on that. His ball carrying ability is great. His interplay with other teammates is fantastic. Very often you'll see him as a centre-back making those tackles where a central defensive midfielder or a more central or a defensive midfielder would be making, right? That's not unusual. And you probably could make a similar argument for Konate, but when Konate wins the ball back, there's possibly an argument that he's not quite as good at redistributing it or quite as good at carrying it. And therefore he just kind of gets rid straight away, previously to a Trent, now to like a Frimpong or someone else. I think we're moving back towards like a 3 centre-back type system. This is first of all why I think we saw Stevenson played so much. He's definitely going to be like a good strength, or at least he's a strong young player who's very good at kind of getting into those wider centre-back positions, but also very good at bombing on if we need to. But also why we saw Endo and lots of different people experimented with in that kind of drop back, deep centre-back type role. And also why when Arne Slot was asked, do you have enough centre-backs? His answer wasn't so much about Van Dijk, Konate and Gomez, but more about, well, look at the coverage we've got here. And a lot of this does rely, I think, on the Dutch idea overall of not necessarily total football, but like some of those ideals of, well, you should be able to rotate into those areas. And we're not saying that you always need to be in this position. No one thinks that Liverpool outright are ever going to play a 3 at the back or ever going to play 5 in midfield or ever going to play 3 up front and then sometimes a 2. But if we are buying Isak and people are talking about Ekitike and Isak and there have been conversations and promises and all those kind of things, well, why aren't we looking at the possibility of a front 2? And how does that front 2 best work? Well, frankly, a front 2 best works in the modern game with the pieces we have in either a 4-4-2, where you've got Salah and Gakpo out on either wing, with then 2 strikers in the middle, but then where's Florian Wirtz? He's not one of the holders. So how does that work? And then you don't really have 2 wing-backs bombing on in that position. So that isn't really, given the personnel that we have, the solution. It works better when you play a 5 at the back, generally, you're looking at a 3, but that can be a midfielder dropping a little bit deeper just to give a little bit of support. That could be Ryan Gravenberch. We could see more of that. Midfield, like a holding 2 of McAllister or possibly Szoboszlai and Gravenberch, so one who drops deeper. Florian Wirtz has to float. Florian Wirtz is not one of the deep-lying playmakers. Even though he can make play from deep, he's not a deep-lying playmaker. He's more of a floating type in and out of the game. We've seen him getting on the ball and just, it's on. Then you've got 2 wing-backs, full-backs. You then have people in the middle who are a little bit more facilitative, right? And you can decide who those people are, right? You can work out if at any one time you want one of those people to be a bit wider or a bit narrower. That's where you play someone who's more like a 10 or someone who's more like a winger who people underlap on, or that they can come inside and then are pushed inside and they're part of a different press. This is the next stage of football for Liverpool, guys. We're not just talking about that being, we're bringing in one player. This is a fundamental system shift, which again, to me, explains why early on Liverpool are taking a lot of risks. I don't think if you want control, especially if you're Slot, you're taking this many risks week in, week out. We were willing to cede so much control in those games to Palace, but also to Bournemouth, just because of how we wanted to play. And that never struck me as like a final situation that we wanted to get into. And then immediately on top of that, we're also looking now at the balance of the front line. At the moment, I still think that there are thoughts within this fan base or within the tactical analysis of Liverpool which go, it's a 4-3-3, that's how it works, and that's what Klopp did, it's what Slot did, and that's what we'll always play. I don't think we're looking at the possibility that obviously while we don't have an Isak, and I think we thought we maybe could get him a little bit earlier, we don't have the possibility of playing a front 2. Obviously the front 2 in like Ekitike and Salah or Ekitike and Gakpo or someone like that. But I think if you're looking at Ekitike and Isak, that's very different. Do you know what I mean? That's a very compelling front line, and it is a very compelling front two. I think a lot of people have been looking at. You know, we're not saying here like it's a revolution. You know, I don't think that Arne Slot by any means is reinventing football. You know, City have been looking at having Haaland and Marmoush. Arsenal, I think at some point will line up with Havertz and Gyökeres. I think overall you would have seen Newcastle, if they bought someone like Ekitike, looking to also get another tactically complementary player, should we call it, for maybe a Vissa, maybe someone like that. Someone who can just be someone to either play off or play alongside. And then you've also got Chelsea, who are looking at what can they do with the front line of the João Pedro +1. There are plenty of other combinations in there. I think Delap and João. Now, we've not seen many combinations of these guys a lot, right? We've not seen that fully play out yet. And we're not seeing like Cole and York. We're not seeing, you know, Maneman in a deeper midfield role and then Heskey and Owen. Not those guys ever really crossed over. You get my point. You're not seeing like Heskey and Owen up front and then creatives immediately behind them. Again, got my timelines wrong. Sorry, guys. I shouldn't have got my timeline wrong there, actually. I watched that in real life. Why did I mention Owen there? Anyway, irrelevant. It irks me, though. What I think we are seeing, though, is a fundamental tactical shift in terms of personnel, and you'll probably see the biggest shift being the way that someone like Sky Sports cover it, being the way that someone in football just chooses to lay out a formation rather than how it actually plays out on the field. And maybe we'll see like, hey, their average positions work out as like a 3-4-3 or even a 3-5-2 if we got two strikers in there. But really, even then, I think we're probably going to see one focal point in Isak and then someone off that. But it's not all that revolutionary to think of this Liverpool squad playing that style of football. Especially if we get Isak, and then we get Mark Guehi. I don't know if we still hold out hope in this transfer window, but I think we still think we can get him, and I think fundamentally if we get him, then it changes the system we can play. For me, when I looked at Leone and I was looking at the way that he played, all of the tactical analysis said right-sided centre-back, okay. But secondly, good on the right side of a 3. Right, so what does that actually mean for Liverpool's front line or where we're at right now? I think at the moment it means we're in a bit of a holding pattern and we are probably slightly more vulnerable heading into these next couple of games as we look to get this transfer window closed than we would like to be. Doesn't mean it's a bad transfer window. I think in getting Gyökeres and Frimpong and Wirtz and Ekitike and in rejigging the midfield, we've done a really good job. We've actually consolidated a lot of that attacking talent, even probably a little bit deeper. And I know everyone's going, oh, they're now all out in attack. We've not quite found that balance. But I think that's also because we've not fixed or tweaked the defence yet, that I don't know what we know about Canate. I don't know what we know about, I don't know how long Joe Gomez sticks around just out of being able to play regularly, those kind of things. We need another starting centre-back in there. And I also think that when we're looking at someone like Mark Guehi, there's a lot of people saying, oh, but he could play centre defensive mid. Yeah, I don't think he's going to start there. I think he's going to start as a centre-back or it's not a libero, but you know what I mean. And I think then we would end up with a front 2/4, which leads to some obvious shapes. And that, it doesn't seem, when I do the calculations in my head, that doesn't seem all out of the bounds of possibility that someone like Slot would think of that, and someone like Richard Hughes or Michael Edwards would suggest a tactical shift. Not necessarily always to a back 3, but just to working out this midfield balance and where we want that control, putting Szoboszlai in his strongest area to be able to control that with that intensity, Gravenberch, McAllister, Wirtz. And also then being able to shift that mid-game and shift to a back 4, because you've got Guehi who can play as part of a back 4, Leone, Van Dijk, Canate, potentially. You've got two guys who can drop a little bit deeper. Gyökeres isn't being quite as adventurous right now. Frimpong, you know, he's almost being too adventurous sometimes. And Endo was almost way too adventurous sometimes. It's about knowing where that balance is. I don't think we've quite found that balance. But what you have, as we get back to the Pythagoras and Boots point, is a bunch of players who are actually really good at positional play mixed with that relationism. And what I mean by that is, McAllister, during the World Cup for Argentina, played a very relationism idea of a midfield 10/8 alongside Messi in mirroring what it was that Messi was doing. Messi goes here, McAllister goes over here. The two almost triggered the other. It's almost like positional relationism, but it basically meant that all the way through the World Cup, he had to read where Messi was going to be in order to A, provide the best cover for him, but also the best complementary position for him to go, right, I'm here, I'm an option, but I'm also pulling this player away here and I'm also doing this at the same time. And McAllister is exceptional at that. Szoboszlai is actually pretty good at that, to be honest. Like Szoboszlai was really thinking about where Salah was for the cross in that had led to the Chiesa opportunity. Chiesa, a relationist player, a player who floats. These are all players who have these abilities. Gravenberch, clearly one of those more defensively minded midfielders who has these great attributes for when we're in control, push downfield, make those options, give us the space to work in and move the ball quickly through the midfield. None of these are like revolutionary ideas, but they're revolutionary if you're working from a Liverpool perspective as to where we've been with Klopp, what we saw and won with last season, and where we want to be next. And frankly, ahead of a tactical curve. Not that I think, we're recreating the wheel. It's just that what at the moment people are sort of going, oh, I see what Liverpool are trying to do because we're looking at the old shape. I think when we look at the, like the zenith of where this Liverpool side can be, the very apex, we're probably looking at a whole different shape. And I don't think that's all that bad because I think that affords us a lot of control. It affords us a lot of attacking output from both Ekitike and the Isak. And Wirtz as like a 10. And frankly, I think it gives Wirtz slightly more of a war chest to kind of go out there and work with. But that is all about balancing a midfield. And I'm not saying Liverpool are always going to play the same formation. I just think what we're adding is a repertoire in shape that we can then go, right, what do we need in this game? What is going to counteract what City, PSG, Arsenal, all these different sides are going to do? And I don't think, as much as I talk about a back three, it's all that conservative because you can look at Amorim, you can look at Conte, you can look at all these different teams. They've been down the years very attacking, very front-footed, and frankly, very good at controlling games. I don't think either it's all that far away from what Pep Guardiola does, but that is, I think we're influenced by Pep, not his shape. More of the roles that you see within what we do. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I think we can see a lot of equivalency between different managers and where Slot is at, but at the moment we're working it out. And I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments below. Who do you think was particularly good? Where do you think the clues are as to where we're going next? And do you think by the end of this window we have 1, Isak, and 2, Mark Guay? For me, what's weird is those are 2 linchpins almost left to the end, but we have to almost leave them to the end of the window to get it right. Anyway, I appreciate what you guys are saying. I appreciate what you're doing. I will chat to you in a little while. There is a membership down there if you want to go get into it. There is, of course, a Discord and a Patreon. Go take a look at all 3 of those. And of course, there's also Super Chats down there if you want to support the work that we do. I appreciate you guys and I'll chat to you in a while. Much love. Bye.